Imagine walking into a room, your heart racing, your mind clouded with a mix of hope and dread. You step into your new school, ready to start fresh, eager to prove yourself and make new friends. But then, something unexpected happens. The glances. The whispers. The subtle, yet unmistakable, feeling that you don't quite belong. For many students, especially those from marginalized communities, this is a reality they face every day. Today, we're diving into a story that captures the painful reality of discrimination in schools and the incredible, unexpected way one young girl faced it head-on. A black teen, full of potential, walked into a classroom where, from the start, she could feel the weight of the stares and whispers following her every move. But what she did next left everyone around her in complete shock. At first, it was the little things. Teachers who didn't seem to notice her hand raised in the air as eagerly as her classmates, or the way the other students would group up and talk in ways that made her feel like an outsider. At first, it seemed small enough, just typical middle school drama. But as the days passed, it became clearer: the discrimination was real, and it was growing more noticeable. The first incident was subtle, almost easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. A comment from a teacher, intended to be helpful, but edged with an unspoken assumption. A glance from a classmate, a second too long, that made the teen question whether they saw her for who she really was, or for something else. It wasn't just one moment, it was the accumulation of these little incidents that built up, until they became impossible to ignore. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Rather than shrinking away, or retreating into herself, this teen did something no one saw coming. When faced with blatant discrimination in a school project, something that was supposed to be collaborative turned into something personal and hurtful, she didn't just stay silent or get angry. No, instead, she responded in a way that shook everyone to their core. The way she stood up, not with anger, but with confidence, and addressed her peers and teachers. The way she took control of the situation in a way that made others question their own actions. It was a response that wasn't just about defending herself, but about challenging the entire system, and showing everyone in that room what it meant to stand up for dignity, respect, and humanity. But even as she stood there, words flowing with grace and strength, not everyone was moved. Some were shocked, some were embarrassed, and some were even angry. The tension in the room thickened. Would her response be enough to change their minds? Would it have the power to shift how they viewed not just her, but everyone else who didn't look like them? The story doesn't end there. What happened next would change the course of the school year, but not in the way anyone expected. The fallout from this single moment sparked a series of events that no one saw coming. Who stood by her? Who turned away? And how did this one teen's incredible strength affect the lives of everyone around her? Stay tuned as we dig deeper into this powerful story, uncovering the full extent of the impact her response had on the school and what lessons we can all learn from it. The battle wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The days following that incident were filled with a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. At first, it seemed like nothing had changed. Life at school went on as usual. The bell rang for class. Friends laughed and talked in the halls. But for her, every interaction felt different now. The look in people's eyes wasn't the same. Some faces showed confusion, others guilt, and some discomfort. It was like she had revealed something that no one knew how to respond to, something they didn't want to face. The whispers in the hallways, the strange glances, these were no longer just part of everyday school life. They had transformed into something more. Her words had stirred something within the school, something people hadn't wanted to acknowledge. It was clear that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the way the school community operated, the unspoken norms that existed beneath the surface, and the fear of addressing uncomfortable truths. The teachers, too, seemed to act differently. The one who had made the comment that had sparked it all, the one who had inadvertently placed the target on her, now avoided eye contact. She could feel it every time that teacher walked past her desk, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. There were moments when she caught herself wondering if that teacher truly felt guilty or was just embarrassed by the whole situation. Did they understand the weight of what they'd done? Or was this just another incident to them, something they could chalk up to misunderstanding? It wasn't just the teachers, though. Some of the students began to treat her differently, too. At first, a few who had once avoided her now made small talk, attempting to ease the tension in a way that felt forced. There was a group of students who, seeing the power she had wielded with her response, tried to support her, even in the most subtle of ways. They smiled at her in the hallways, nodded when she passed, and tried to make her feel like a part of their circle. But it wasn't enough. She could sense that it wasn't real. It wasn't genuine support, it was more like an attempt to ease their own guilt. Then there were the others. The ones who didn't change, the ones who continued to throw glances at her that weren't kind. It was as if her response had made them feel exposed, like she had peeled back the layers of their comfortable lives and made them confront something they'd rather not. They didn't know what to do with the power she had shown, and in their discomfort, they rejected it, clinging to the familiar rather than face the change she was forcing them to see. Among the sea of mixed reactions, one thing became clear: she had awakened something in everyone around her. But what that something was, no one seemed to know. She had cracked open a door, but the room beyond it was still hidden in shadows. No one had the courage to step through just yet. They were waiting. She was waiting. But it wasn't just the school that had changed, it was her too. Something had shifted within her. In that moment, standing up for herself, responding with such calm yet undeniable strength, she had tapped into a power she hadn't known she had. It wasn't the angry, shouting power of revenge, it was something deeper, something more grounded. It was the power of self-respect, the power of knowing your worth and not allowing anyone to take that from you. At night, she would lie awake, replaying the events in her mind. Her words. The way she had spoken. How her voice hadn't wavered. It was strange because, at the time, it hadn't felt rehearsed or calculated. It had felt natural, as if it was the only response she could give. But now, with the world of school still buzzing with the aftermath, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Could her response have been too much? Could it have pushed people away rather than brought them closer? She didn't know. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but there was also a part of her that refused to apologize for what she had done. For once, she had spoken her truth, and it had changed the course of everything. But it wasn't just about her feelings. There were the others, the students, the ones who had been too quiet, too passive. The ones who saw what happened but didn't say anything. The ones who wondered whether they should have spoken up too. Her response had opened up a space where those questions could no longer be ignored. And in that silence, there was a kind of reckoning happening. It wasn't just her voice that had been heard, it was the voice of everyone who had felt overlooked, dismissed, or discriminated against. It was a moment that had made them question their own actions, their own complacency. And still, the questions lingered. What would happen next? Would things truly change, or would they go back to how they were before? How much would her response ripple out into the school? Would it spark more conversations, more actions, or would it be forgotten as quickly as it had started? The uncertainty continued to build. The principal, too, seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. Conversations had been held behind closed doors. Some teachers were calling for more training on diversity and inclusion, while others wondered if the issue had been blown out of proportion. But the students, especially the ones who had been affected by discrimination in their own lives, were beginning to take matters into their own hands. There were whispers of protests, of gathering together to speak out against the injustice that so many had endured in silence for far too long. But who would lead it? And who would follow? One afternoon, As the bell rang signaling the end of the school day, she walked out into the parking lot, the weight of the day heavy on her shoulders. The air was crisp, the sun beginning to dip behind the horizon. She was about to get into her car when a figure appeared beside her. It was one of the students who had never really spoken to her before. She was hesitant, looking down at her shoes, as if trying to find the right words. I just wanted to say, the girl began, her voice barely above a whisper, what you said in class. It was powerful. You didn't let them get away with it. I respect that. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. It wasn't the kind of compliment she was used to, not the kind that came from people who just wanted to make small talk or stay in their comfort zones. This was different. This was someone who saw her, really saw her. Thank you, she replied quietly, her voice steady. It wasn't easy. But I couldn't just let it slide. The girl nodded, still looking down. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a recognition of shared struggle, of quiet strength. And just like that, something changed. The silence between them was no longer awkward, it was filled with the potential of what might come next. As the two of them stood there, an uncomfortable truth lingered in the air. One response had already set everything in motion. But was it enough? Was it truly going to change the way things had always been? The tension was palpable, growing thicker with every passing moment. And still, the mystery remained: how would this story end? What would it take to turn those quiet moments into lasting change? Would more students find their voice like the girl beside her? Or would fear and complacency continue to rule, even after everything had been laid bare? As the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The days that followed only seemed to deepen the tension in the air, and it felt as though the whole school had been suspended in a moment of uncertainty. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Classes continued, clubs met, and students moved between lessons as they always had. But under it all, something was brewing. She could feel the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation, like an invisible thread pulling at her, reminding her of the moment she had started this chain of events. Some people were still avoiding her, unsure of what to say or how to act. It wasn't just the students who seemed to be stuck, though. The teachers, too, were walking on eggshells. She could see the nervous tension in their eyes when they spoke to her, and it made her wonder if they felt guilty for the role they had played, however unintentional, in allowing the discrimination to go unnoticed for so long. In the lunchroom, the usual cliques seemed to have reformed, but there was an underlying shift. Some groups were more divided now, as though certain students had chosen sides without even meaning to. There were the ones who had approached her after the incident, offering words of support or solidarity, but their actions didn't always match their words. She'd hear them muttering among themselves, speaking in hushed tones that she was sure were about her. It was as though they wanted to help, but didn't know how to without risking their own comfort. Then there were the others, the ones who had stood silent when they should have spoken up, the ones who, in the aftermath, seemed to resent her for forcing them into this uncomfortable space. There was one in particular, a boy who used to sit in the back of the class, quiet and unobtrusive, but who now seemed to go out of his way to avoid even looking in her direction. He hadn't been one of the students who had actively joined in the bullying, but he had been complicit in the silence. And now, it seemed as though he couldn't even face her. It was a strange thing, realizing that some people were afraid of the change she had initiated. They feared the disruption, the new reality she had exposed. But even more unsettling was the realization that she, too, was beginning to fear the very things she had set in motion. Could she handle the ripple effect of her actions? Was she strong enough to carry the weight of this new reality? After school, when the halls emptied out and the noise of the day faded away, she found herself questioning the whole situation. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation she'd had with that girl in the parking lot. The girl's quiet words of admiration had lingered in her mind, but so had the silence that followed. What would happen now? What did the girl actually expect from her? Was it just a passing moment of recognition, or was it the start of something more? She tried to focus on her homework, but the weight of it all made it hard to concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to the scene in class, the look on her teacher's face when she had spoken up. She had caught a glimpse of the teacher's discomfort, a fleeting moment of guilt that disappeared as quickly as it had come. Was the teacher thinking about it now? Was she rethinking everything she had ever said to the class, or was it just another day, another lesson to be taught? And then there was the principal. The principal, who had been strangely silent in all of this. The school had held an assembly about diversity and inclusion shortly after the incident, but it felt more like a formality than anything else. The principal had delivered a speech that seemed rehearsed, more about covering bases than addressing the real issues. The whole school knew it, and yet no one dared to speak up. The tension in the room had been palpable, but no one had said anything. No one had dared to challenge the principal. But there was one thing she couldn't shake. The feeling that this wasn't over yet. That this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that could reach far beyond her school. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but she knew she couldn't back down now. The problem was, no one else seemed ready either. She was on her own in this. At least, that's how it felt. Days later, in class, she caught sight of the boy who had been avoiding her. He was sitting at his desk, his face hidden behind his textbook, but something in his posture caught her attention. He was tense, his body language closed off. And then, as if by some unspoken cue, he turned his head slightly, and their eyes met for just a brief second. He quickly looked away, but the fleeting moment was enough to make her wonder. Was he finally going to speak up? Would he apologize? Or was he simply avoiding her out of shame? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that she wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. But then came a message, a simple text that showed up on her phone late one evening. It wasn't from anyone she expected. It was from a student she had never spoken to much, someone from a completely different grade. The message was brief, but it carried a weight that caught her off guard. I saw what happened. I get it. But be careful. The school is watching. You're making people nervous. She stared at the message for a long time, the words sinking in slowly. Who had sent it? What did they mean by the school is watching? And why was this person warning her? There was a strange feeling of fear in the message, an undercurrent of something darker. She didn't know whether to feel relieved that someone understood, or terrified by what the message suggested. The next day, the tension was even thicker. There was a heaviness in the air that she couldn't explain. It was as if something was about to happen, something big, but no one knew what it would be. When she walked into class, she noticed that some students were whispering again, only this time, they were looking at her more openly. She could feel their eyes on her, the quiet judgment in their stares. Then, out of nowhere, the principal called for a meeting after school. The notice was brief, almost casual, but it sent a ripple of unease through the school. What was this about? The administration hadn't said anything publicly since the assembly, and the fact that the principal was personally calling students in for a meeting felt ominous. Who would be called? And why? As the final bell rang that day, she found herself walking toward the principal's office, her mind racing. She didn't know what to expect, but she had the nagging feeling that this meeting would be the turning point, the moment when everything that had been bubbling under the surface would finally come to light. Would she be asked to explain herself? Would they try to silence her? Or would this be the moment where everything she had done would come to fruition? The door to the principal's office creaked open, and she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension in the room was palpable. The principal was seated behind a desk, flanked by a couple of teachers. No one spoke, but their eyes were sharp, fixed on her, as if waiting for something. What would happen now? She stepped into the principal's office, her shoes clicking against the cold tile floor. The door closed softly behind her, shutting out the noise of the hallway. The room was quiet, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms clammy against the fabric of her jacket. She looked around, trying to gauge the mood of the people seated in front of her, but their expressions were unreadable. The principal, calm as ever, leaned back in her chair, eyes focused on a file in front of her. The two teachers flanking her didn't even look up. "Have a seat," the principal said, her voice smooth, but there was something sharp about it, something that sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated, then slowly took the empty chair across from them. The moment she sat down, she felt the weight of their gaze, as if they were waiting for her to speak, but unsure of how to begin. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until the principal finally broke it. "We've called you in today to discuss the situation that's been unfolding in the school," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "You've made quite an impression on your classmates, and we want to address it." She couldn't help but feel her chest tighten at the words. Made an impression, that was one way to put it. The reality was far more complicated. It was no longer just a single moment of standing up for herself, it had turned into something bigger. Something that was spilling into the whole school, and possibly beyond. "What do you think is happening here?" the principal asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you think this has become such a topic of conversation?" The question was straightforward, but the way it was asked made her feel like it wasn't just about the facts. It was about her. About what she had started, and how much control she had over the situation. She felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. Taking a deep breath, she answered slowly, "I think it's because I spoke up. I didn't let what was happening go unnoticed. I said something when no one else did." The principal didn't react immediately, but the two teachers exchanged glances. It wasn't a look of understanding, though, it was something else, something closer to concern, as if they feared where this conversation might lead. "I see," the principal said at last, her voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now, like a subtle warning. "And do you think this has been helpful for the school?" There it was. The question she had been waiting for, the one that would define everything. What did she think? Was it helpful? She had stood up for herself, yes. But now, the aftereffects were clear. The division. The tension. The way people were starting to choose sides. Was that helpful? Or had she made everything worse? "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect this. I thought people would see it for what it was, just me standing up for myself. But now it feels like it's more than that." Another silence, thick and heavy. The principal exchanged another look with the teachers. It was a look that made her stomach twist, but she couldn't figure out why. It wasn't just concern, it was something deeper, more calculated. Something that suggested they were trying to decide what to do with her next. Finally, one of the teachers spoke up, a man who had been quiet up until now. "We understand the need for addressing injustice," he said, his voice stern, but not unkind. "But we also need to think about the bigger picture. You've started something, and whether you realize it or not, it has consequences. Not just for you, but for the whole school." The words hung in the air like an accusation, but she wasn't sure how to respond. Was he implying that she had gone too far? That standing up for herself was a mistake? Or was he simply stating the obvious, that everything had changed, and no one knew how to handle it? "Do you understand the weight of your actions?" the principal asked. Her voice was steady, but the question hit hard. Because there are people who don't want to see things change. There are people who would rather things stay the way they are. The words were sharp, and they felt like a threat. She looked down at her hands, gripping the edge of the chair, her mind racing. Was this really happening? Was this the moment where they would try to shut her down, where they would push her back into silence? I know I can't change everything overnight, she said, finding her voice again. But I'm not going to stop. I can't? Not now. A long pause followed, the tension in the room rising like the pressure before a storm. The principal's face remained unreadable, but there was something flickering in her eyes, something that seemed almost calculating. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't exactly approval either. It was as if she was weighing the consequences of what she was about to say next. After what felt like an eternity, the principal finally spoke. You're not the only one affected by this, you know. This isn't just about one person's actions or one person's words. There are others who have their own stories to tell. Stories that are just as important. But how we address them, how we move forward from here, that's what matters. The tension seemed to intensify as she finished speaking, and the weight of her words settled in. It was clear now that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. This was about the entire school, the system, the way things had always been. The principal was trying to make it clear that there were forces at play here, forces that had been in place long before she'd ever walked into this room. But what exactly did that mean? What was the principal preparing her for? We're giving you a choice, the principal said, leaning forward slightly. You can keep pushing forward with this movement, whatever it is that you've started. Or you can step back. The decision is yours. The words hit like a punch. Step back? Could she really just step back after everything that had happened? After everything she had fought for? She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but in that moment, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for something bigger. Something that had been buried for too long. But before she could respond, the door to the office opened, interrupting the moment. A student, a girl from her class, stepped inside, her face tense, her eyes wide with concern. She looked directly at the principal and the teachers, then at her, and in that split second, everything changed. I need to talk to you, the girl said, her voice shaky but determined. It's about what's been happening. It's not just about one person. We need to talk about all of it. And just like that, the room seemed to shift. The tension broke, but in a way that only made things worse. Something was happening. Something bigger than any of them had anticipated. The girl who had entered the room seemed out of breath, her cheeks flushed with a mix of fear and urgency. She glanced quickly at the principal and the teachers, and then her gaze locked onto her. There was something in her eyes, something desperate, that made the tension in the room escalate even further. For a moment, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, the air thick with uncertainty. The principal was the first to react, her expression hardening as she glanced between the girl and the students sitting before her. This isn't the time or place for interruptions, she said, her tone sharp. But the girl didn't back down. She stepped further into the room, her eyes never leaving the student who had sparked everything. I'm sorry, but it can't wait, the girl insisted, her voice shaking. It's about what's happening. All of it. I've been trying to keep quiet, but I can't anymore. It's bigger than just everything. It's bigger than the bullying, bigger than what you think. The room went silent. Even the principal, normally so composed, was taken aback by the girl's words. The teachers exchanged looks, their brows furrowing in confusion, as if they were waiting for something that hadn't yet clicked. But the girl wasn't finished. She took another step forward, her hands trembling as she spoke, her words now rushed and desperate. I overheard something. I know what's going on behind the scenes. I know that the reason no one's doing anything about this isn't because they don't care. It's because they've been told not to. told to keep quiet, to leave things as they are. The shock of her revelation hit like a wave, crashing over everyone in the room. The principal's face tightened, her eyes flicking to the teachers, and for a fleeting moment, she looked like she was considering whether to shut the girl down or listen to what she had to say. But before anyone could react, the girl continued. They've been shutting people up, silencing anyone who tries to make waves. This isn't just about one student speaking out. It's about a system that's been protecting the ones who've been causing harm. And the worst part? They've been using fear to keep everyone in line. Her words were like a spark in a room full of dry wood, setting off a chain reaction of whispered gasps. The principal looked like she had been slapped, her face pale. The teachers, who had been so composed just moments ago, now wore expressions of disbelief. The girl's confession hung in the air like an accusation, something too big to ignore, too dangerous to deny. The student who had been sitting in the chair, still reeling from the principal's previous question, now found herself caught in a whirlwind. This was bigger than anything she had imagined. Bigger than standing up in class. It was a web of power, manipulation, and silence that stretched far beyond the walls of the school. And suddenly, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting against something much darker. The principal slowly leaned forward, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk as she studied the girl who had spoken up. There was no anger in her gaze, at least, not outwardly, but there was a cold calculation there, as if she were weighing the risks of what this conversation might mean. I think, the principal said, her voice slow and deliberate, that we've had enough for today. Perhaps you should take a moment to gather your thoughts. The conversation will continue, but not here, and not now. But the girl wasn't done. She stood her ground, refusing to be dismissed so easily. You can't stop this. You can't pretend it didn't happen. I know what I heard, and I know who's been pulling the strings. The principal's expression shifted, the mask of composure cracking just for a moment, revealing something more guarded. You're making a mistake. You don't understand the consequences of your actions, she said, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. You don't know who you're dealing with. The words hung in the air, pregnant with warning. The tension reached its peak, and for a split second, it felt like everything was teetering on the edge of something terrible. The student could sense that she was on the verge of something massive, something that could either bring the truth to light or destroy everything she had worked for. But before the moment could spiral further, there was a knock at the door. A new figure entered, an unfamiliar man, dressed sharply in a suit. His presence was immediate and commanding. The principal's expression flickered with surprise, but then quickly smoothed over as she gave him a slight nod. The man stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the group with a cold, calculating gaze. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tension there. I was informed there was a situation that needed my attention. His eyes locked onto the student who had been speaking out. I believe this concerns you. The room seemed to freeze. The principals and teachers exchanged uneasy glances. But the man's presence seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. It was no longer just a discussion between school officials and students. It had shifted into something much larger, something far more serious. I've been following the situation closely, the man continued, his gaze unwavering. And I'm afraid we can't let this go on much longer. There are things at play here that need to be dealt with, before it goes any further. The girl who had spoken out looked between the man and the principal, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Who was this person? Why had he been brought in? And what exactly did he mean by things at play? For the first time, she felt truly afraid. This wasn't just about her standing up for herself anymore. This was about something much more dangerous. Something that had been hidden, and was now being brought into the open. But no one was going to let it stay open for long. The man didn't wait for anyone to speak. I suggest we end this now, he said, his voice final. There's too much at risk. We can't afford to let it escalate any further. The student's pulse raced as the realization hit her. She had just stepped into a battle much larger than she had ever imagined. Something was being kept hidden, and if she wasn't careful, the truth could cost her everything. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick like fog, as the man's presence loomed over the conversation. Every word he spoke felt like a final decree, a decision made before anyone had a chance to respond. The principal and teachers sat rigidly, as though they had no say in what was about to happen. And the girl who had spoken out, standing in the middle of it all, felt a sudden rush of cold dread. This was no longer just about her voice being heard, this was about something far more dangerous, a game of power that she had never fully understood, but was now trapped in the center of. The man's gaze never wavered as he addressed the room, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. This has gone far enough. The situation is out of control, and it's time to stop pretending it's anything but what it is, a problem that needs to be solved. And not by these games of manipulation and false narratives. The room fell silent again, the words hanging like a heavy weight. The girl's heart raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. This wasn't just about her standing up for what was right. This was a chessboard, and she was a pawn in a game that had been played for far longer than she had realized. Everything she had thought she knew about the situation, about her school, her classmates, even the adults around her, was suddenly called into question. The principal's expression shifted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the flicker of something that looked like fear, but deeper, more calculated. You don't understand, she said, her voice quiet but steady. It's not just about one student's actions. It's about the bigger picture. The system is fragile. We have been trying to manage the balance. There are things here that have been in motion for years, and you've only just scratched the surface. The words were chilling, and the girl realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't just a conflict between a student and the school. This was a deeper issue, something tied to the very foundation of the system itself. Something dark. She had opened a door that no one wanted opened. The man didn't seem surprised by the principal's words. He simply nodded, as though this was all part of a plan. That's right. It's about keeping things in control, about maintaining the order. What you started, what you uncovered, it's too late to undo. Now we need to decide how to handle it before it spills over into something much worse. Her mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that they weren't going to stop. They weren't going to let her win. They weren't going to let the truth come to light, not without a fight. And the fight was one she wasn't prepared for. Before she could speak, the girl who had originally brought the issue to light, the one who had revealed the truth, stepped forward, her hands trembling. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, her voice shaking but firm. We can't keep hiding this. I won't let you keep protecting the ones who have been causing harm. She had already faced the darkness of her school's hidden truths, and the idea of walking away without finding the full story wasn't an option. Tell me what's really going on, she said, her voice steady now, even if her heart was racing. The woman gave her a long, assessing look, as if measuring her resolve. Finally, she spoke. You've already uncovered a great deal. The system that protects the wrongdoers is bigger than you think. It's not just the people in this room. There are layers upon layers, hidden alliances, promises made in dark corners, a network of people who ensure that those in power stay where they are. But there's more. You weren't supposed to figure this out, not yet. The girl's pulse quickened. She wasn't supposed to figure it out. What did that mean? Her thoughts were racing, trying to connect the dots, but every time she thought she had an answer, another question popped up in its place. The truth is, this situation didn't start with you, the woman continued. It didn't start with the bullying or the mistreatment. It's been going on for years, quietly and deliberately, shaping this environment into something that's easier to control. Your bravery has made a ripple, but this ripple could bring the whole thing crashing down. The girl's mind was spinning. What had she really uncovered? And who was she really up against? I didn't ask for this, she said quietly, though she didn't expect an answer. The woman seemed to understand. No one does, but when you stand up to what's wrong, you take on more than just the problem in front of you. You're challenging an entire system. The principal, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Enough, she said, her voice tight. This has gone on long enough. We can't keep pretending nothing is happening. What's done is done. The girl turned toward her, her mind still racing. The principal was no longer the authority figure she once seemed. She had shown cracks, moments of doubt, moments where she wasn't in control. And the teachers, the ones who had been so quick to dismiss the girl's concerns in the past, were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The woman's voice broke the silence. You've seen the cracks. You know this isn't about the surface level. There's a much darker undercurrent running through the school and through the town itself. The girl finally understood. She had stumbled into something much larger than a fight for fairness or recognition. She had uncovered a hidden network of influence, where people in power manipulated situations to protect their interests and maintain control over everyone else. But what she didn't know yet was how deep this went. Who else was involved? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do with this knowledge now? I want to fix it, the girl said, her voice resolute. I don't care how big it is. I'm not backing down. The woman gave her a long, searching look, then nodded slowly. I didn't think you would. That's why we're here. You're not alone in this anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, the girl wasn't afraid. She didn't know exactly what was coming next, but she knew that whatever it was, she wasn't going to face it alone. The next few days were a blur. The woman, whose name was revealed to be someone with deep ties to the local community, became a silent partner in the girl's journey. There were meetings, conversations in dimly lit rooms, and calls made to people who had been in the background for years. Slowly, the pieces started to fit together. There were records to be uncovered, conversations to be had, and most importantly, allies to be found. As time passed, the girl found that there were other students who had been through similar struggles, teachers who had quietly questioned the system but never spoken up. Some were afraid of what would happen if the truth came out, while others were just too tired to keep fighting. But all of them had one thing in common: they were ready to fight back now, in their own way. The girl's efforts began to spark something more than just conversations. It sparked a movement, small at first, but powerful enough to start shifting the narrative. Word spread about the hidden network of influence that had been shaping the school and the town, and soon, parents, community leaders, and even local media were involved. It became clear that the school wasn't the only institution with secrets to hide. The town itself had become a web of systems that protected the powerful and ignored the voices of the people who needed to be heard the most. But the final showdown didn't happen in a boardroom or in a meeting with school officials. It happened in a quiet conversation, in the middle of the night, between the girl and the woman who had helped her along the way. The truth is out, the woman said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. It's only a matter of time before everything falls apart. You did what needed to be done. The girl paused, considering the weight of her words. But will it be enough? She asked. Will anything really change? The woman smiled, a faint but knowing smile. Change doesn't come all at once. Sometimes it's slow. But the most important thing is that you started it. And that's how change happens. One voice at a time. With those words, the girl understood that her fight wasn't over. But she had changed the game. The system that had once seemed so impenetrable was now cracked, its foundations starting to shift. And no matter what came next, she knew she had sparked something that couldn't be extinguished. Months later, the atmosphere at the school felt different. The principal, once a figurehead of power, had been replaced. The teachers who had once turned a blind eye were now beginning to listen. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, still more battles to fight. But the first step had been taken. The truth had come out, and it had set something into motion that could never be stopped. And in the end, the girl realized something important. Sometimes, standing up for what's right doesn't mean you get to see the final victory yourself. Sometimes, it's about setting the wheels of change in motion, trusting that others will pick up where you left off, and knowing that the truth will eventually win. The last chapter of her journey had yet to be written, but she had played her part. And in doing so, she had become something more, a symbol of courage, a reminder that change is possible, and that sometimes, all it takes is one person to challenge the system and make a difference.